Schofield. The date is March 1, 2007. At this time, I'm 77 years old. And Larry has asked me to do a little interview. So I'll start out, and he can ask me questions. But I'll start out where I was born. I was born in Moody, Teton Ward, Madison County, Idaho, on 10/18/29, to Leo and Hazel Schofield. I was born at home.
You got the dog in there?
My cousin had to get up in the middle of the night and ride for the doctor.
I'm going to have it done. I can't
And
afford to.
that was in the old rock
I
house
can't replace anything for
at the
$1,500.
2 miles south of Teton.
Anything.
That home was owned by my Uncle Henry Richmond. In the spring of 1930, we moved up to the old Sylvester place, which my dad bought, and that was where I was raised most of my life. It was a farm, and we had no running water, we had no electricity. We didn't get electricity till I was in the 8th grade, when they brought a line out from Rexburg. And at that time, we were able to drill a well, and we had inside plumbing. But up to that time, we had 2 cisterns that we filled with water every spring, and that's the water we used. Mother would, we would fill the old aluminum boilers and heat them on the wood stove. Every Monday morning was wash day, and at first she had she did the clothes with a scrubbing board, and then a few years later she got a Maytag washing machine with a gasoline engine on it that we put on the back porch and run a hose out the doors for the exhaust fumes from the gas motor, and then that's how we would wash, and that was quite a step forward. I grew up on the farm, and it was during the Depression, and people didn't have much. In fact, everyone that I knew was poor, but we really didn't know we was poor because we had love, and we had food, and we had a warm home, and we had the things we needed. But it was after I grew up that I found out how poor we really were, and it was a good time. I went to school. I started to school in the 1st grade in Moody, which was a two-room schoolhouse. The first 4 grades, they had 2 school teachers, usually a man and wife, but not always. The first 4 grades we called the little room, and then the next 4 grades up to the 8th grade we called the big room. It was a nice school. It was a brick school. We had a gymnasium, and there were no school buses, and I lived about a half a mile away from the school, and I usually walked to school or rode my horse, and we had the normal normal grades that we had writing, arithmetic, English, and spelling. And during the winter months, at recess and noon, we'd always play basketball, and in the summertime, springtime, and fall, we would play baseball. Now, when I was in the 8th grade, for the first time for many years, we had 5 boys in the 8th grade class. So we had enough, and then we had 1 boy in the 7th grade. So we had enough kids for a basketball team.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went to Sugar City to a basketball tournament, and that's when I met my future bride. I never met her. I saw her for the first time. And she did something to my heart. And anyway, I said, someday I'm going to marry that girl. She was a cheerleader from Newdale, and I was playing on the Moody team. And then I graduated from Moody grade school, and I went to Sugar Salem High School. And of course, Joyce, she was a year behind me. The next year, when I was a sophomore, she came to Sugar City to school. And when I was a sophomore, or when she was a sophomore and I was a junior, that's when we started dating off and on. But my sophomore year was an exceptional year for me. I won
he's not in there. He's not down
the
there.
district mile run.
Look out the front door, see if by any chance he got out.
And then I got to go to Moscow to the state track meet. And then I was on. Should we stop for a minute while we're talking?
It's up to you.
Let's stop for a
Okay.
minute. And I was on the Sugar Salem livestock judging team, and we won in the district, and then we got to go to the state up to Moscow, and we won the state livestock judging team that year. And whenever you win in the state, you would always get a trip to Kansas City. But this was during the war, and they'd canceled all trips, so we got a big plaque. We didn't get a trip to Kansas City. But my high school days were wonderful days. When I was a senior, I became the student body president. Well, when I was a junior, I became the student body president for my senior year. And I played basketball. I lettered in basketball, football, and track. I didn't play baseball much because I wasn't very good at throwing the ball. Anyway, after the year I graduated from high school, I graduated in 1948. And I went to Rick's College that first semester. And on New Year's Eve of 1949, a blizzard started, and we were snowed in for a month. We didn't get get out of. We weren't able to go anyplace in
Wow.
the car, and that was. I was home, and Bob was home. We were the only two that were home. Bob was about 8 years younger than I, and we were feeding a bunch of old thin cows. We were feeding them number one potatoes, what they called diverted potatoes. They poured dye on them so you couldn't sell them. They paid the farmers so much for them, but they were real cheap. And so we were feeding these cattle washed number one potatoes and pea straw, fattening them. And when this blizzard started, it blew drifts right over the top of the corral, and the cattle just walked right out over the top poles of the corral and out free. And of course we couldn't haul any potatoes from Newdale because of the weather, and so we were stuck in there for a month. And that of course Bob couldn't go to school. He was all the schools were closed. The main railroad from Idaho Falls up through the valley was all closed. They couldn't get up, the trains couldn't get up it. The highways was all closed, and you couldn't hardly drive a team out in the fields because the snow was so deep. But we had to go up and get a load of, Dad and I would go up every morning and get a load of pea straw, but we'd go over and up along the rim of the Moody Creek Canyon, and the wind had blown the snow, so there wasn't much snow along there, and it was just like a highway up to the pea straw. And it was really an enjoyable time. We had a radio, a battery radio, and we could listen. No, I'm sorry, that was after we had electricity. We had a radio. We didn't have any TV, but we did have a radio. And we would get the chores done in the morning and then just come in the house and listen to the radio, and it was great. You didn't have to go to school, and all your friends and neighbors and everyone around you was just like you were. But anyway, there was one little incident about in the middle of the storm. We had plenty to eat. We had lots of food, but we run out of yeast cakes. And so Mother couldn't make any bread or biscuits, and all she could make was baking powder biscuits. And after about a week or 10 days of baking powder biscuits, we got awful tired of eating them. So I decided to get my little mare out, and we were just about 2.25 miles from Teton. And I was going to ride up there and get some yeast cakes. And I got about less than a half a mile away from home, and I'd ride her over the fences and out in the field, any place to try to find some shallower snow, but I couldn't find any, and she was just lunging in that snow. And when I got up to Harris Sidaway's place, she was just completely give out. So I took her in. I went into Harris's and talked to him, and we put her in his barn, and I walked the other mile or so up to Teton and got the yeast cakes and come back, and I had to leave the mare there, and she was there for 3 weeks before I could get her home.
Wow.
Till they plowed the road out. And anyway, that was quite a blizzard. And then that spring, I married Joyce Nyber on April the 2nd in Coltman, Idaho. And we moved in. My dad had built a new garage out away from the house, and I dug a trench from the house over to the garage, and we run a water line over there. So we didn't have any hot water, but we had cold water, and the garage had a kitchen and a bedroom and a living room. We divided it into rooms, and that's where we lived. Let's see, Kathy was born on February the 28th, 1952. And that was one of the happiest days of my life. My mother and I, she was born in the St. Anthony Hospital, and my mother and I took Joyce over there, and we were up all night, and she was born about 6:30 in the morning. And then a year from that day, on the 28th of February 1953, Micah was born in the St. Anthony Hospital. And of course that was another happy day for me. And then I'm wrong on my dates. I think that was 1951, I'm sorry, and 52 instead of 50. Those dates are wrong. It was 51 and 52. And in 1952, Joyce, we had Mike and Kathy, and we moved to Rupert with Rex and Afton, and Joyce and I, and Rex and Afton had Kelly and Ramona, and we had Kathy and Mike, and they were just little kids. We lived together, and we worked out for Joyce's brothers. We contracted the sprinkling systems for Clausen Farms, but before we did the sprinkler system, we contracted all their plowing and getting their land ready for sugar beets and grain. And we hired tractors. Well, Rex had a tractor, and I had a tractor that I took down of my dad's. And then we hired several tractors and several men from up here, and we went down and did all that, the spring work. And then when it came time to put the irrigation systems out, the sprinkler pipe, we contracted all that, and we
You want to give him a kiss now? Show the camera that was...
well, its camera isn't going, Joyce, it's just noise, so make it loud.
You got hair in your nose.
Oh.
Okay, I'm going to lay down for a minute.
And is
I got to take some oxygen.
is my dates right? Kathy was born in 51, Mike 52?
Yes.
Okay. But
I was
anyway,
there. Where were you?
we contracted that sprinkler all that summer, and they would pay us so much a line, and then we would pay the guys so much a line to move them. And then that fall, I bought a 1952 International 2-ton truck, and I hauled beets and potatoes for the Joyce's brothers. And then we moved back to Newdale. And the next year, while we were down in 52, Joyce's dad had traded his dry farm for the Green Canyon Hot Springs. And so when we moved back, we moved it that fall. We lived in Newdale, and then the next spring we went to work for Joyce's dad and Merritt up to Green Canyon Hot Springs, and we worked there in 1953 and 54. And 54 is when Dan was born. And so the last year up there we had the 3 kids. We had Kathy, Mike, and Dan. And there was lots of experiences with those kids up there. Sneaking into the swimming pool when we weren't watching, and getting in mud fights and all sorts of things. That was a happy time for us. And then in 1955, we moved. That's the year that Lorene was born, and we moved to Rigby and rented a farm from Merritt's wife Maureen's father. And we farmed there a year. The ground was real rocky. We just raised hay and grain. And then in 56, in the fall of 55, we moved down to Paul, and we lived out on the north side, and we worked for Joyce's brothers. Let's see, we worked for her brothers for about 3 years, and then my brother Bob and I, we bought what we call the Smith place. It was 480 acres, and that's where Janet was born. And we lived there and farmed until 1964. And then we moved back to Paul. Bob and Cleola moved back with us, and we rented a farm from Darwin, Joyce's brother, and we farmed there. And Bob only stayed 1 year. He didn't like it down there, and he moved back. But we farmed rented a farm from Darwin for 2 years, 64, 65. And then in 66, we moved over to a place that Warren owned, and we started to buying that place, and we run just cattle on it. And that's when, but going back a year, when we still lived over on the place that we rented from Darwin, that's when Mike met Rita. And occasionally, he would slip out of the house at night and walk down to the Nelson's place.
Oh.
which was, I don't remember how many miles, but it was a good walk. And one year, Steve, or my nephew, my sister's Glenna boy, he came and stayed with us. And it was at this place over where Darwin's place. And him and Mike used to slip off quite often and go down to the Nelson place to see Rita. And it was years later that when we were down to California, Mike and Steve were talking, and we didn't know anything about it, and Glenna didn't know anything about it. But anyway, they had a rifle, a .22 rifle, and they were out fooling around with it and struggling with it, and it went off, and the bullet went right between their heads. But that's the way it is with kids. Sometimes you find out things later on that you didn't know. And anyway, we farmed there. It was just the cattle. We didn't raise any crops there. We just raised cattle, and cattle didn't do very good. And after about 3 years, we lost that place. So I went to work for Dale Klingler, managing a cow-calf operation. We had 2,600 head of cattle, cows, which is a lot of 300 of them were first calf heifers. I managed that for 2 years, and then we moved out between between Burley and Oakley, and I went to work. It was called Scientific Farms. There were 6,400 acres. It was a big corporate farm, and I managed the water on that for a year, and then they canned the manager, and Bob Howard and I co-managed that place for a couple of years. And then in 1971, Joyce had been working for the Ponderosa Inn in Burley as a troubleshooter, and they sent her up here to Idaho Falls because they bought the Ponderosa Inn here in Idaho Falls, and they were having trouble, and they needed somebody to straighten this out. So the shareholders talked me into moving to Idaho Falls because they wanted to keep Joyce. And that's when we moved to Idaho Falls, and that was in the 15th of December 1971. And we lived in, Joyce's parents had a home over on 3rd Street, and her dad had died, and her mother was living with one of her brothers or sisters down in Paul. So we moved into that home, and we lived there for 2 years. Now I'd like to stop for a while.
Okay. Where to go?
Okay. Now I need to go back to 1971. That's when John was born. And Joyce was working. He was born down to Burley. in the Burley Hospital, and he was born on the 2nd of June, and Mike and Rita were married on the 5th of June. Joyce never did forgive them for having that reception 3 days after, and she had to stand in that line, but she got over it. Anyway, John was 3 years old when Joyce and I got divorced, and we were, and while we for I can't remember exactly how long, but John lived in Pocatello with Mike and Rita for a while, and I can't remember the exact length of time, but for a while. And we were divorced for about 2 years, and then we remarried, and here in Idaho Falls. And so I've lived in Idaho Falls since 1971, and Joyce lived in Pocatello and worked in Lewiston most of that time that we were divorced. And then when we got remarried, we've lived in Idaho Falls since. And while we were divorced, I went to work for Schaefer Oil Company, and I worked for them for about 9 years. And then in 1981, I had a heart attack and had to have a heart bypass, and that was kind of a scary time. I drove myself from the First Street over First Street Mobile Estates to the old Parkview Hospital, and all the time I was having a heart attack. I don't remember driving from First Street to 17th, but I remember coming to driving down 17th Street, and I knew I was having a heart attack, and it was about 4:30 in the afternoon, and the traffic was bumper to bumper, and I couldn't pull off of the road, and I couldn't stop in the middle of the road, so I was praying and trying to talk. I could feel myself losing it, going under, and I was just talking myself, if I can just get to Boulevard and turn south, then I'll be able to pull off. Well, I made it to Boulevard, and I remember starting down Boulevard, and I was still conscious, and I pushed on the gas just as hard as I could, and I pulled into the Parkview Hospital and stepped out of my van, and that's the last I remember. The next I remember, I woke up in Salt Lake, and they'd given me a bypass. And by putting things together, I guess I stumbled into the emergency room and said, I think I'm having a heart attack, and passed out. And Dr. Stutz who was a new doctor in town. I hadn't met him, and he worked on me, and then he rode the plane to Salt Lake with me, and from the time I entered the hospital until I entered the hospital in Salt Lake, he brought me back to life 12 times.
Mm.
And another thing that happened at the hospital, and I don't remember anything about it, but Mike called my 2 home teachers, and they came up and give me a blessing. And I never met them or Dr. Stutz until 2 weeks after I got back from Salt Lake.
Mm.
I don't remember a thing, and anyway, that was I owe that all to the good Lord and the good doctor,
Mm.
and those brethren giving me that blessing. And after I got back from Salt Lake and I was able to do a little bit, I went to work for the Better Business Bureau until I got to where I figured I could now wait a minute. Stop your thing, Larry, a minute. I've got after I'd had my heart attack, I couldn't do much physical work, so I stopped at the ARA house one day and asked them if I could do some volunteer work, and they give me a job. And so I went to work in detox over to the ARA house, and I worked there for about a year. And then I decided, well, if I'm going to work in this business, I want to do more than be a detox attendant. So I talked to Bill Dick, and I got a chance to go back to Fort Lyons in Colorado, which is a VA hospital, and it was the only VA program, a drug and alcohol abuse program in the United States. And I went back there and graduated with an associate's degree in drug and alcohol counseling. And then I came back and went to work for ARA I worked, they sent me to Rexburg. I had an office up at the courthouse in Rexburg, and I was over Madison, Fremont, Teton, Jefferson, and Clark County. All the DUIs and all the individual counselings in those counties. And I worked there for, till 1986. And then I moved to Elko, Nevada, and went to work as a counselor down there. And I worked down in Elko until 1997. I came back to Idaho in March the 1st, That's 10 years ago today. 1997. I moved back to Idaho. And while I was in Elko, I worked out. I had an office downtown in Elko, and I did outpatient counseling down there. And every Monday I would come up to the treatment center, and I would do meditation, and then I would do a class, and then I would do a group therapy. That was on Mondays, and then on Tuesdays I'd go to Battle Mountain, which is 75 miles away, and I would counsel down there through the day, and then at 7 o'clock at night I'd do a anger management class. And I did that until, like I said, I retired down there. The first day of March is when I came back to Idaho, 1997. So that would be 10 years ago today. And since I've been back in Idaho, I've been semi-retired. I worked in a motel as a handyman, and I worked at DI for a while, and then I worked over to the airport, and then I went to work for CART Transportation, and I worked there until about a year ago. But I started getting sick spells about 3 years ago, and since that time I've kind of gone downhill. I've worked when I could, but anyway, about a year ago I had to quit working entirely. I couldn't work anymore, and I haven't been able to drive for, well, it was 2 years ago in March that I had to give up driving. One of the things I didn't say is when I was down in Paul working for Joyce's brothers, I got a piece of steel in my eye, and I lost my left eye. And then here, about 5 years ago, I got macular degeneration in this other eye, and I drove for a while. I drove as long as I could, but finally it got to where I decided I better not drive anymore, and so I haven't driven for, it'll be, I guess 2 years this March since I've driven. But they've been happy days. I've been able to work in my garden, and when I was still able to drive, I was able to go to the temple anytime I wanted. And then after I couldn't drive, I was blessed to know some very good people over here, the Mufflers. And they would take me to the temple, and they take me to church, and they've been a great blessing in my life. Now, that's just a kind of an overview. There's been many other things happen in my life, and I'm gonna let Larry ask me some questions, and as I think of things, one of the things I want to touch on is before Joyce and I, after we got married, and I started, up until that time, we were